What if I told you that some of your favorite health foods weren't here to help you, but to hurt you? That's because the kale, the spinach, the sweet potatoes, and the almonds are filled with something called anti-nutrients. So what is an anti-nutrient? Well, I would point you to our interview with Sally Norton to find out more about that one. Because whether it's lectins, phytates, or oxalates, these anti-nutrients could be the silent cause of your skin issues, digestive distress, or even your arthritis. And today's guest has not only studied this subject in depth, but has experienced the unfortunate pain and suffering that these anti-nutrients can cause your body. So let's try to answer the following questions, shall we? Are anti-nutrients really something you should worry about? And if so, what do you do about it? Why is it that some of these so-called superfoods are really more of a villain when it comes to your health? And how can supplementing vitamins to help with these issues sometimes be your savior, but at the same time, a detriment? We cover it all here. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any of the amazing guests that we have coming up on the show. And with that, let's just jump right into it. We're joined today, like I mentioned in the intro, Jeff Allen, who has a plethora of experience, both professional and unfortunately throughout his own life with the various topics we're going to be talking about today, specifically around anti-nutrients. But I'd love for you to introduce yourself and kind of give us just a little brief background on what has got you into this interest of health, nutrition, all of this stuff, and how it's been a part of your life in a major way.
Yeah, great question, Ryan. I always say that I think the beginning of, my nutrition passion started as a child. I remember memorizing cereal boxes, and what percentage of, calcium or phosphorus it had, and how many carbohydrates, how many sugars to carb, complex carbohydrate ratios, right? Back in the 90s when complex carbs were, extremely great, and, fat was terrible, and, protein should be eaten in moderation, right? And which is, of course, it still should be. But, as a child, I just remember really falling in love with nutrition. And, eventually I did, go to school, not for that, but really to get into, physical therapy. And then I kind of decided to go the pre-pharmacy route. And that kind of decided not to be the option for me. And then when I kind of found out that, you're in school, you have all these additional courses that you've taken, and you're like, what is going to translate to being the best route that I can take that I know I'm going to enjoy in my life, but at the same time not have to take, so many additional classes? That is when I found nutrition sciences. So that is where I ended up. So I do have a nutrition sciences degree from UNLV. I managed a nutrition store, paid my way through college by doing that. And then during that time, ended up with a lot of additional certificates for, herbal sciences, homeopathy, various other things, obviously vitamins and minerals. And, just because I think a lot of companies kind of require you to obtain those kind of certificates to sell them, the more advanced lines. So, that continued through that. And the rest of my nutrition background, really, after I stopped kind of, managing a nutrition store, just from a financial standpoint, it certainly has its ceiling, Ryan. So I, at that point, really most of my nutrition, experience was really just personal research, and a passion for something that I've continued through my personal life. And really in the last couple of years, where I found myself being in big trouble, although I do believe that I've probably had what me and you have both discussed, and where we actually met is through, a B6 toxicity group. I do believe that I've had issues with B6 my entire life. But it really got bad in early 2019, when I began juicing very heavily. I was drinking 2 32-ounce spinach smoothies a day to, do some alkaline balancing, a lot of, celery juicing, and maybe the one that might have put me over the top. You kind of know me personally, Ryan. I tend to go over the top just a little bit with things, but boiling parsley juice, which I found out later was one of the highest oxalate or substances on the planet. And then I would boil it and drink it to actually get rid of the heartburn that I've had virtually my entire life. And oddly enough, it worked. As we do know that sometimes our bodies will begin to store those oxalates, and as they move into storage, we tend to feel better when that poison is not in our bloodstream. Very, very similar to heavy metals, right? We, typically don't find people with high levels of, mercury or cadmium or arsenic, right? Those things tend to get stored in tissues. But it was during that time, after about a month or two, that I just developed extreme neurological symptoms, tremors, just much worse heartburn, and GERD, just muscle twitches all over my body, numbness and tingling in my extremities to the point that I really couldn't even feel my face any longer. And not being able to, kind of even feel your iPhone when you're touching it, which actually still does occur with me today. But, luckily that, road to recovery for me, as the title is for your show, has, been long. But once I found out what it was in the middle of 2020, and I stopped B6 toward the end of 2020, that has certainly gotten a lot better. And my body's ability now to fight endogenous oxalate production has gotten much better, that my B6 numbers are down and my body is actually able to use that nutrient in the way that it's intended.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point you bring up. And let's see if I can bring myself back here. There we go. Because I think a lot of people, we've talked about this a lot, Jeff, just on our own time, but a lot of people take supplements because they feel they need it, but they don't necessarily. And this is something that we've talked about a lot in that B6 toxicity Facebook group, is basically you may be pounding yourself with maybe a B complex, but if you're not utilizing any of those nutrients and it's just circulating around, what's the point of having the excess per se? And in some cases, like with B6, we found, and there's published literature, which I was very surprised to hear at the beginning, because if you were to look up B6 toxicity, it basically doesn't exist in like Google of anywhere under, I think, 100 milligrams a day for like an extended period of time. But we've seen people, and actually seen published research on PubMed that's been shared in the group, with people experiencing sort of extreme dehydrating events and then experiencing some sort of toxicity with much lower doses. And if you look at like the European RDAs for B6, it's very different than the United States RDAs. And I've kind of compared that around with other various nutrients, whether it's selenium or any other vitamin or mineral, which I found really fascinating, because there are these massive differences between various RDAs, or even the use of pesticides, example of like glyphosate and Roundup in Europe versus here. And it's just like this real messed up mixed message thing that we get into. And it's really worth exploring when you're in such a desperate state like you were, exploring all the options, because when you know nothing, that's kind of the worst feeling in the world. So
Yes.
it's really difficult. So, but you've been on this kind of healing journey for like you said, 2019. I think everyone I've met sort of fell apart in 2019, including myself. But what was sort of the antithesis for your discovery of oxalate and B6 being the problem for you? Like, when did that kind of come to fruition in your search?
Yeah, great question. So I think my knowledge of oxalate probably began in nutrition school, right? I mean, UNLV certainly taught some things about oxalate, but not from this is a poison to your body, right? So it's mostly taught at like a clinical level. I mean, this is a long time ago, right? I mean, this is 20 years ago now. But I mean, it's mostly or almost 20 years ago, I guess. But I mean, it's really mostly taught as an anti-nutrient, the way that you explain it, not necessarily as a poison to your body, but it's spinach, broccoli, and all these other sources of calcium or magnesium are bound to oxalate or phytate, right, which is essentially inositol. And that's another thing that we can maybe expand on later, is that we talk about these as anti-nutrients, and they certainly are, right? They bind minerals. That's what they do. But at the same time, we've also found that phytate or inositol is really effective for helping people with extreme anxiety and in higher doses. So there's good and bad, right, with everything. But certainly what we were taught back then is things like dairy. Not that I'm this massive dairy promoter or anything, but you are going to obtain a more bioavailable calcium by getting something that is not binding the minerals, right? So if you measure the calcium in spinach, right, that's what the FDA does. It measures the amount of calcium in spinach, but how much of that is going to be bound by a high oxalate substance like spinach? It doesn't mean that spinach is bad, but we've talked about spinach from a standpoint that when you're sautéing it, when you're cooking it down, you can ingest, quite a bit, versus maybe you just eat a spinach salad. It's light. You're not getting a whole lot of oxalate. You're still getting the chlorophyll though, and all of the many of the other things. So it first started more as in understanding that these things bind minerals in your gut and essentially prevent the absorption into your body, right? But when I started having all the twitches and everything else, I began examining what had shifted. And so because, I had the GERD, I tried to stop it in January of 2019. And I moved more toward a really, really vegetarian vegan diet. And so much of what I was eating really became oxalate, right? So
Mhm.
I examined what had changed, over the last 3 months for me as my symptoms really began to get bad in March of 2019. What was going on with these twitches, examined what my diet was, and my oxalate intake had just dramatically skyrocketed, right? I mean, to the point that 64 ounces of spinach, in a smoothie, and juicing, very, very high oxalate vegetables, or even boiling parsley juice. By the way, when you drink it, it is, I mean, the oxalate really, really gels up, right? I mean, it's probably not something I should have been drinking, but I read online, right, that hey, this is going to cure heartburn. So we all get desperate, just as you say, and we do things that maybe don't make a whole lot of sense in from an excessive standpoint. But
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, Ryan.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say that I think there are so many people that can relate to this, especially when you're going online to better your health and like try and figure out some sort of, what's going on with your body, dealing with the GERD. How can I, help that symptom up? And you find that, I mean, right now plant-based everything is like really heavy just in general community, and I don't really want to like dive down that rabbit hole of stuff. But there are problems because people were just not made to take these things and like think about in nature. When would you have been able to pound and juice like 300 grams of parsley into a little cup and grind it up? It just doesn't make any logical sense, which I think is kind of going to be the message of this podcast, is looking at things from a logical point of view. Like, does this make sense to be doing this all the time? And juicing, like you said, was something I personally never got into, but it's a big thing. And it's something that we talked about with Sally Norton for basically getting into an oxalate trap. And for me, when I started experiencing neurological symptoms in the summer of 2019, I basically was like going down the rabbit holes. Is like, is this MS? Is this this? Is it this? I was like certain it was MS for a while. So I found Terry Walls, lovely doctor. I've had her on the podcast, talked to her. She knows her stuff. Brilliant. Worked with her for a little bit. And she has a very plant heavy focused approach to healing autoimmune disease, and has had quite a great success with herself and other patients as well. However, because it is plant heavy, you're having 9 cups of basically vegetables a day, a lot of those being leafy greens. A lot of people are pounding these oxalates 24/7. And for some people, that can become a problem. And it was something I didn't even think of as being a problem because I've read you could boil them out. But like you mentioned, we talked about this before, boiling them can also reduces the girth of the roughage for spinach, for example, and then you can end up just eating more, even though it may be 30% reduced oxalate. So it kind of defeats the purpose in a sense. And then in some cases, it doesn't reduce it quite as much from what I've understand by talking to Sally Norton and her experience with it. But I just think it's something that people should consider when they're doing any sort of dietary intervention in an extreme sort of fashion. You need to consider the amount of certain things you're doing and to make sure that you are actively going through food rotation and not constantly probably slamming the same thing. Because I went through the same thing where I was somebody that avoided dairy because I heard dairy was terrible for you. I was drinking almond milk every day. How much of that calcium am I really absorbing? Because almonds, huge oxalate food. I was also consuming a lot of almonds. Apparently oats have a bit of oxalate in it, eating a lot of oats, and spinach in my eggs every day. So I was kind of in that oxalate train, and I've done some like urinary analysis through organic acid testing. And although I wasn't extremely high in oxalate, I wasn't like crazy above whatever the reference range was in, and we'll talk about sort of testing and biomarkers to look at for oxalate, because I think it's kind of you need a multi-level approach when you're looking at it, because there isn't just a good singular test per se to see like how much oxalate's in the body. Because like you said, it's like heavy metals, your body's going to rip that out of the bloodstream and store it because they know it's going to cause damage on some certain level. But my urine oxalate was on the high end of the reference range. It was like almost over. And that's kind of when I was thinking like, oh, maybe that's a problem. So maybe we can kind of jump into that. Like what biomarkers were you looking at, and what were you finding along with this excessive B6 that you discovered? What were you finding that was just like, oh man, maybe I'm taking too many supplements of this that's causing this over here to be out of whack and all that good stuff. I could talk all day, but I'll let you talk.
Yeah, so could I, Ryan. So yeah, thanks. If I keep talking, please feel free to cut me off.
You're great.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I've taken a few organic acid tests. Oddly enough, my markers for oxalate are never generally high. There's probably a few reasons for that. Generally your alkaline phosphatase runs a little bit higher than mine does, right? So my body tends to want to store it, right? And even, being blood type A, your body tends to store oxalate more than other people, right? So I've got, the genetics for it, I've got other things, but the odd, I'm not sure I've really got an organic acid test that would be truly accurate, because every time I've taken an oat or an organic acid test, I have been on very high, good amount of B6. So when I took one initially on my own, I had a doctor that I sent a very, very long email to, which maybe I should have shortened it, but, going through what I ate, what I was taking through each phase of the 2019 process, essentially explaining to him that I thought something was robbing my body of minerals. And there I kind of arrived. That was around when the first time I had, taken an oat, but again, was using B6. Never went above the 100 milligrams of what the upper intake level was. Knowing that is what the line was for the United States. So I kind of viewed it the same way that I was taught it clinically. And so I didn't think that was an issue. Later in the middle of 2020, I took an organic acid test. All of them showed extreme B6 deficiency, B1 deficiency. And although I'm taking an enormous amount of those vitamins, it just didn't really make sense. Now, knowing what we do know, Ryan, it does make sense. is that I'm taking all of this B6, and now because I'm taking it, especially in the form of pyridoxine, where your body typically has to phosphorylate it, and my body is already very, very low on alkaline phosphatase, which is essentially what phosphorylates that enzyme and makes it into pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is the active form of vitamin B6. So I'm going through and I have, this deficiency. So now my body is not only my body is not able to fight it producing endogenous oxalate. So I'm producing all of this endogenous oxalate, which to me is something that often is not discussed and it is overlooked. The majority of the oxalate in our body is actually made by ourselves in most people, and we don't really think that, leaky gut syndrome and you have a susceptibility to oxalate. We think, okay, everything is just going to a low oxalate diet, when in reality, avoiding glycine and hydroxyproline and proline, all amino acids, especially found in gelatin, collagen, bone broth, avoiding those types of things a lot of times can be a better uh, way to stop that endogenous or your body making its own oxalate. Is probably a better way. And then getting your B6 down to a level that your body is actually able to utilize it instead of being so high that you have all of that pyridoxine in your blood that is blocking the ability of your body to utilize P5P. There's a lot of these things that are published, in PubMed, and really, I don't like the word proven, but I really show a lot of statistics to indicate that probably is the case.
I would 100% agree with what you were just saying, and just the importance of looking at multiple variables when trying to kind of discern this for oneself. Like you mentioned, the alkaline phosphate for me was like at least one of my indicators for potential like storage of oxalate being high. And then the other was the importance of making sure that you are utilizing the active form of B6, because if you just have a number circulating, it's not doing anything. And I think that because you can test, and we talked about this too on the phone, you can test for B6, and you need B6 to, I believe, stop or help break down endogenous production. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. To break down, to stop or to maximally stop, you can't stop it, right?
Right.
But but thiamine or B1, magnesium, and B6 are really your rate limiting factors for endogenous oxalate production. All three. So typically, if people have a lot of endogenous oxalate production, they have either poor utilization, poor absorption, or some other kind of deficiency of one of those vitamins or magnesium, which is obviously a mineral.
Right. And I think if people like go look, and we'll discuss some testing in a moment, but when people go and test for their B6, there's usually two different markers that either if you go through LabCorp or Quest or whoever your doctor uses, look at. It's pyridoxine and or the whatever the active form, the P5P. And so which is a better marker to look at? Because I know I've actually had both tested, and therefore I've gotten like two different reference ranges of what's normal. And it's hard to understand, at least for me, which marker is more beneficial to look at for utilization or being high or low in your bloodstream, because this is something we've talked about privately as well.
So you bring up a question that I'm on a panel, to try to help B6 with some of the people that me and you know together. You're in one of the more narrow groups that is, we don't allow a whole bunch of people to join, but even in a smaller panel of people all over the world, we still cannot actually get an answer from Quest or LabCorp as to what they are actually testing for. So other countries, when they actually get a test, it will define it as pyridoxal 5-phosphate or P5P. Here, it's just vitamin B6, and that is what LabCorp says. That is what Quest says. Quest actually does say pyridoxine on it, but we're not really sure if it's actually testing pyridoxine or not. What I will tell you that we have found is that LabCorp generally seems to have a much higher reference range. That we definitely know, much higher for men. They actually distinguish between men and women, where Quest will just, where Quest will just have a 2.1 to 21.8 range, where
LabCorp goes to
varies,
40, I believe.
Which one?
I think LabCorp goes to 40 or something.
40,
like
40,
that.
I believe it's 43 for men, right? And it goes to 35, I believe, for women. So, I mean, they actually, and from just a statistical standpoint, it's virtually impossible, right? For, they're looking at the American population, right? And lab companies evaluate, testing the same, right? I mean, there's no calcium or magnesium marker where Lab and Quest are testing an identical, compound, where 2 standard deviations this way and 2 standard deviations this way, where the American population is going to be that far off. So what we have at least determined is that we do believe they're measuring different substances. So, my guess is that LabCorp is probably measuring pyridoxal 5-phosphate, and Quest is probably measuring pyridoxine. LabCorp tends to be, for most people, from what we have found, it tends to measure low. And then Quest, when people go and get everything measured at Quest, it's almost always higher. So generally speaking, if somebody is high on LabCorp, that is, generally look at that as potentially concerning. The other thing is, if it is measuring pyridoxal 5-phosphate, is that bad that it's higher? Maybe that's a good thing, right? So, we've seen people within that panel go get measured. Somebody that, I don't want to name any names or anything, but we've seen that person measure very, very low on LabCorp and then come in and Quest and measure roughly where I do. So something seems to be off there, because you can't have, and it's not always 2 standard deviations this way and 2 standard deviations this way, but generally that's how lab companies analyze things is, within a certain reference range. They're looking at, stats on, how many people on average, but, 2 standard deviations between the mean. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's more than that. I mean, it can be calculated differently, but that's generally how they do it. So when you have a range that's that far off, what I am relatively confident in telling your audience is that I do believe that they're testing different things. I'm fairly confident in saying that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense based on like what I've seen. I will say that my general practitioner, and at least a lot in my area, go through LabCorp for all their testing. And so on the specific test sheets, when I get the results, it does say for B6, and then in parentheses pyridoxine. So, and that I've always measured in lower. I remember checking this like mid 2019 in the fall, and my pyridoxine was, or whatever, the B6 from LabCorp was like on the range of, like we said, to 43. Mine was like 9. And I don't think I've ever had anything higher than that. However, I have done it through Quest, and it would be in the middle of the range versus, and that's kind of the difference. So I think both numbers could be valuable, but the question of like, which is giving you like the proper information of like, should you worry or not, is still kind of a little up for discovery in a sense.
Yeah, and what compound are they measuring, right? And so, because the problem is they both say pyridoxine. Now I know that from LabCorp, we actually have not been able to find something on that. I actually used one of your tests for Quest and gave that to the panel, but it didn't put your name on it. And didn't, put, I just kind of took your name off. But, to show like, hey, this is what is, being measured, and it says that. But the problem is pyridoxine, pyridoxamine, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. I mean, they're all in America used so interchangeably that we don't look at anything different. So it's almost impossible to have that much of a range off, right? I mean, there's no, if you look at calcium, LabCorp caps at 10.2, the other's 10.3. I mean, that makes sense, right? There could be that much of a difference in the population. It can't go from 43 with a cap of 21.8. It's impossible, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. The way
What's really strange is I've seen some ranges where it goes from, I can't remember what it was. I got it. It was just another testing facility, and where the numbers were like up to 100 something were fine with B6, and I was like 60, so I was like halfway to whatever. But like you said, it didn't distinguish at all what they were testing. I'm assuming that might have been like P5P or something like that, just based on the range. But that's the thing that kind of gets annoying, is like, if you're going to test, you might as well test almost the same thing from the same place, so you have like a consistency of data. But it's one of those things that's kind of a pickle. But maybe we could just, for the audience, talk about the importance of B6 with the endogenous oxalate production, and why it's important that you are utilizing that for that reason of oxalate.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing. And one of the things that I think oxalate is becoming a problem is not necessarily that we're such a plant focused, we're becoming so much more plant focused.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have leaky gut, obviously glyphosate and a lot of those things are linked, and more people probably have it than what are certainly realized, or in other complications, Crohn's, or all of those things are certainly growing. But, without, when you're drinking energy drinks, when you're eating cereal that is high in B6, when we eat probably too much meat, right, in this country on top of that, right? So everything we talk about in balance, but now all of a sudden we find people who are going on these diets that are really high protein, or keto that has a lot of oxalate intake, as well as higher B6 diets. I think what you're finding is we have so much supplemented B6 on top of diets that are really not necessarily balanced diets, and so you're upping your B6 in your body, and generally you have something that, as we're getting our B6 numbers higher, we're stopping our body's own ability to actually utilize this B6. So any supplemented form of pyridoxine, whether it's an electrolyte beverage or Gatorade, or an energy drink, or a cereal, right? You're getting a form that your body does have to phosphorylate, right? And we know that pyridoxine does block the ability of pyridoxal 5-phosphate to be utilized in the body. So the more of all of these things that are occurring, the less your body can use that B6. So in my personal opinion, you have a lot of people that are, now all of a sudden they get deficient in B6, their body, that becomes a rate limiting factor in endogenous oxalate production. So we have all this B6, but we have no ability to actually utilize it. So now our body just continues to make the oxalate over and over again, especially in circumstances of, we talked about the proline, hydroxyproline, glycine. So, all three of those are your biggest, factors. Collagen, bone broth, and gelatin are three, things that will generally have high amounts of those naturally. But then we've also privately discussed vitamin C, right? Other, hydroxy carboxylic acid, I believe that's correct. So hydroxycarboxylic acid, I believe, yes. So citric acid is another one that can, really, really up your endogenous oxalate production. And then really high levels of fructose can actually do it as well. So, those are things that you want to watch out for. High doses of vitamin C, at least from a internal standpoint, or citric acid from an internal standpoint. And that includes forms of citrate. Everyone thinks, oh, I take citrate, that's going to be the best form of this magnesium or calcium. In reality, it's when your body, takes it in, it's going to take it in as citrate. So if you're taking high doses of those things, citric acid is much more dense than the calcium and magnesium that you're taking, right? It's a relatively dense molecule in comparison to a minor mineral that is much, much less dense molecularly. So you're taking in a lot more citric acid than you might think. So those are all things to watch out for, where then B6 becomes a problem from an endogenous standpoint. Or, obviously magnesium deficiency is a big problem there too. And so is thiamine. So it can be any of those three, but typically, you're going to find that one of those three is probably the rate limiting factor.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to this discussion around balance and how just unbalanced a lot of people that develop these problems, whether what their diet is usually pretty skewed one way or another in some respect. They're getting an excess of this, but not of this, so there's no balance here, and so this becomes elevated, and then this becomes elevated, and this is depleted. We've talked about privately, we talked about being really low. We're burning through like magnesium, stuff like that. We've talked about different things like other minerals, like measuring calcium and then copper and zinc being some issues as well. And so I think one thing that, the audience would definitely want to take away from this is with gelatin, bone broth, vitamin C, all very hot things over the last year in general, vitamin C, because of, the virus that shall not be named on the website. But people have been taking these megadose vitamin Cs. I know I, in the past, have, not for like extremely long, consistent amount of time, but for people that may necessarily not get vitamin C from their food or whatever enough, like what are the levels of what's safe-ish and what's not safe to ingest as far as it goes with broth and vitamin C? Or is it one of those things where it's just like you shouldn't supplement with it at all? You shouldn't be drinking like any bone broth if you're having these problems, because it's going to be different for different people. But I just wanted your thoughts on that overall, because I know people are going to wonder that.
Yeah, I think how about we just look at what we generally agree, like, juicing, right, is just a form of condensing something into a way that we probably should not be doing it, right? We're taking away fiber. We're just putting in, sugar, but we're still getting all the oxalate. We're still getting all the other things that are going into it. But anytime you take something from nature and you're condensing it, to me, that's when issues begin, right? So if you're going to, make a bone broth and you're going to, put bones in it and you want to make it yourself and you're going to cook a soup, or you're going to eat a general soup that has, that is based in beef broth or chicken broth or something like that, I don't really see a major problem with it. However, what happens when we start condensing things, right? Collagen, right? Now all of a sudden we're taking collagen and we're putting it in a protein powder. Now all of a sudden we're taking something that would be a very minor component, right? If we measured the protein content in bone broth, what is the protein content, right?
It's actually, I will say one thing on this. If you were to use chronometer or chronometer, however people say it, I've heard it like 20 different ways. It's probably like one of the better apps to get at least just a rough idea of where you're sitting. It's not great, like we mentioned before, for calcium, because you'll put spinach in and it'll tell you how much calcium's in it, but how much are you utilizing? Like 5%. So it's not great in that respect, but it'll give you a rough idea. So like when you plug in like broth, like bone broth that you make from home, you're really actually not getting that much protein and glycine in comparison. Yeah, actually, you're hardly getting any, to be honest, in comparison with if you were to use like Vital Choices or Vital Proteins collagen powder. Shout out to Jennifer Aniston and her promo of that, which has like, I think per scoop it's like 3 or 4 grams or something or more, which is
I believe
condensed.
It's 20. I think I can
maybe
pull
you're
it
right.
out of
Maybe
my
you're
own
right.
cabinet and tell you that.
Okay.
Because a scoop of protein, right? When it's just, you're just taking the protein from collagen. You're going to get, in 20 grams, you're probably going to get, 17, 18 grams of protein, because you're really just extracting the protein. There's going to be a few minerals in there. There's going to be, some other compounds that are going to come from bone, but I mean, really, you're just getting the protein of it, right? Bone broth protein, right?
Yep.
You're taking all of what would be in the bone, and you're just taking the protein powder. When they do those condensing, just like juicing, right? You're still going to get some of the other compounds to get dragged along with the protein, but generally, they're really just extracting the protein. So your glycine, right? I mean, all of those things are measured in the protein. Your hydroxyproline, your proline, all of those numbers are going to increase with the protein, right? Content, because that's what protein is made up of, is amino acids, right? So, to me, that's where the line is. You start really supplementing with something. Now you begin to have a problem where there's nothing wrong with chicken broth or beef broth or I mean, if you're vegan, fine. You don't. It's not that you need these nutrients, but you're just really, really upping it when you begin to do that. Where making even your own, you're not getting that. You're just getting a lot of the things that are in the bone that are healthy for you that are being boiled out without without the other components that are not necessarily, in my opinion, healthy substances for most people.
Yeah, and that's kind of what because I've had several people reach out to me and they've asked me like similar questions about like collagen and stuff like that. And I kind of take a similar approach to you with if it's kind of a manufactured condensed product as I'm going to use that word condensed now because that's a way better way to put it than I put it. But when it's condensed like that, or it's like a vitamin that's isolated and then put into a high amount, it kind of changes the balance of everything. Whereas if you're getting a cup of bone broth, you're kind of getting a better ratio of amino acids because it's just naturally occurring. There's not some sort of synthetic, or not necessarily synthetic, but not some sort of implanted amount of this over this, which happens when you condense things and add things to other stuff or take citric acid versus naturally occurring vitamin C, etc., like that. And for vitamin C, I generally tell people to just like stick under, like if you're going to supplement and like maybe you're not getting a ton from your diet, and I've talked to you about this because I wasn't sure myself. I just tell them to like keep it under like 500, like don't go high, and if you can split it up, like I think you told me.
If you're going to take 500, you're much better off taking it 3 or 4 times a day, in 125 milligram doses. Because when you take it all at once and your body can't, absorb it, that's when, and it can't utilize it. That's when those, hydroxycarboxylic acids start moving toward endogenous oxalate production, right? Because it just can't be utilized. I'd probably, if you have an oxalate problem and I'd probably stay under 250. But, for most people, 500 is probably fine. But again, if you take it all at once, we always say, water soluble vitamins, you're going to urinate it out and there's no other issues. But again, citric acid, right? Or ascorbic acid, ascorbic acid is vitamin C. Any acids like that, I mean, you're creating that endogenous oxalate production above what your body can utilize.
Yep, exactly. That's a really good point. I think another thing to mention too is when we're looking at oxalate, kind of the other minerals that can be affected because of it binding to things such as copper and magnesium. And we've talked a lot privately about hair tissue mineral analysis testing to look at body stores of certain vitamins, because it just gives you a little broader picture of what's coming out, what's coming in, staying in. And I know you've shared your numbers privately with me with some pretty like astonishing like values and how they've changed. I've actually not seen too many that are like, oh, that stuck out like that. So maybe we can kind of talk about the value of that type of testing for looking at oxalate or just mineral balance in general, as well as looking at like blood copper and blood zinc, because we see that low in people pretty often, especially zinc.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the blood, just because there's so much more science on blood, and I can explain why copper and zinc are low from an oxalate standpoint that is scientifically based. And, you know, when we get into hair tissue mineral analysis, there's just not a lot of strong science to necessarily support it. So when I go into those, I just want to let your audience know these are my personal experiences. They are things that I do believe in, but you know, there's just not a lot of, you know, money, unfortunately, right? Everything a lot of times has to do with money. You know, there's not a company that has that kind of, you know, capital to raise, right, to, you know, fund what HTMA is going to do for us. So from copper and zinc standpoint, I love copper and zinc blood and copper urine as well. Copper urine is maybe my favorite indicator of all of your oxalate status, potentially. And the reason is copper has the second highest affinity for oxalate to form an insoluble compound, which essentially means forming a crystal, okay? Where a soluble compound like sodium or potassium oxalate is easily excreted through the urine. Mercury is actually number one. So mercury oxalate gets stored very, very quickly, but we don't have a lot of mercury in our blood, right? Mm-hmm. Mercury isn't floating around in our blood for a reason, right? It gets stored into tissues. So those are things that we'll talk about on the HTMA in a moment. But copper is something that is needed in the blood, right? It's needed for a lot of different things, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about histamine. You know, copper is, you know, is vital for histamine, you know, to be lowered in the body and to be broken down through diamine oxidase or DAO. And so that is one of the reasons, you know, with all this. But copper blood, right, because we don't have a lot of mercury in there, copper has the second highest affinity to form that crystal because so often our bodies want to store the oxalate. And so the number one compound that it's going to want to store is copper. And so now oxalate gets released, you know, from the body in whatever form. We endogenously produce it, or we absorb it through food, right? With a leaky gut, or, you know, or it just gets absorbed even through a non-leaky gut, which can happen. You know, now all of a sudden, what's it going to want to bind to? Copper, to me, is really number one, right? So now we've got blood copper being lowered, and then we also have oxalate and histamine problems that both occur together, right? And tend to, you know, oxamine, histamine, and sulfur all seem to have issues, you know, together. So copper a lot of times is deficient in the blood and in the urine. Zinc is actually number two. So we often think that zinc and copper are so, you know, antagonistic of each other, right? And they're the biggest. And in reality, copper and zinc are not as antagonistic as people think, you know, maybe in the liver. But I mean, look at superoxide dismutase, one of our body's biggest defenses, right? Both require copper and zinc to work together, right? So when you have both of those things, right, that are being eliminated, that are almost the first really to bind to copper and to store, zinc and copper blood is almost always low in people with oxalate issues. I find that is maybe the number one thing that I can say from a science standpoint. We see it in the group when we're beginning to see it all the time. One of our groups is actually allowing copper deficiency to be discussed. Before it was considered alternative medicine. It is not anymore. I was personally by a neurologist diagnosed with copper deficient myeloneuropathy, right? Sorry, difficult word to pronounce there, Ryan. Yeah, so I mean, but in reality, it was B6. B6 and copper are much more antagonistic than what zinc and copper are, right? They're extremely potent. So as your B6 is elevated, copper is going to go down. You know, as your copper is raised, B6 is going to go down. You know, it's probably to keep in balance, right? Because they're both involved in DAO, you know, to break down histamine. But then we get into the HTMA. As calcium and magnesium begin to elevate and, you know, potassium and sodium are low, obviously generally a sign of adrenal fatigue, right? When you have low, you know, sodium and potassium and you have very high calcium and magnesium. But calcium and magnesium are much more insoluble, from an oxalate standpoint than sodium and potassium. So one of my theories is as you get a little bit better, those calcium and magnesium numbers begin to decline, your sodium potassium begins to raise, is you're getting rid of some of the common oxalate storages. Mercury is a common one. I know you've had high mercury. I've had high mercury. I've done these tests every month for 2 years. I have a lot of data in supplementation and what works and what doesn't. You saw in my last one, I finally have my sodium within a normal range. That has not happened in 2 years. It's taken a lot of salt to do that. On other things, Ryan, HTMA is very difficult to analyze. As you supplement or increase things, you're going to find that they drop. Lithium is one that we've talked about. Typically runs with potassium along with rubidium. Rubidium, potassium, and lithium tend to run, connected with each other. But as I increased my lithium, with just natural supplements like concentrated mineral drops, which are very, very potent in lithium, my lithium just dropped like crazy, right? Oddly enough, stopping it completely went back up again. One of the reasons for that, or theories, is I shouldn't say reasons. Theory is a better way that I would like to use with HTMA, given that it is not a whole lot of science on it. But it's excreted through your urine, right? So if your lithium is high and it's getting excreted through your urine more, less is going to go through your hair. So that is one of my theories about the sodium and potassium being lower. Is obviously adrenal fatigue is a big problem, so I'm not denying that. But for people with oxalate problems, if potassium and sodium are low, you're hoping that they're low, right? Because you want that oxalate to be insoluble. You want it to move through your body through a urinary standpoint, because if it goes from a urinary standpoint from an insoluble compound like calcium, what happens? Kidney stones. It's the only way that a common person or even a doctor is really educated from an oxalate standpoint is what is a kidney stone? It's calcium oxalate 80% of the time.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That's something that we kind of dived into when I spoke to Sally Norton about this very subject, was that sort of misnomer around oxalates as being only a calcium oxalate kidney stone, because that's basically the only time, if you were to Google it, you ever hear about it, or you ever hear about somebody dealing with it, is usually through a calcium oxalate kidney stone. But there's just so much more to the story that doesn't get discussed. I think makes it a little harder for people to figure out because of that at the same time. And one thing you brought up too was the mercury earlier. And one thing I just found very fascinating about my own blood work was that people know this, I was a mega tuna consumer for a couple of years, like daily. And so naturally, I kind of was like thinking about that in the back of my head all the time, but I didn't really worry about it until potential problems surfaced, as we all do. And something I found really fascinating was like you said, it doesn't stay in the blood very long. None of these things stay in the blood very long because your body's trying to store it away, because it's a toxin. It doesn't want it circulating around all the place where it can do damage. So it puts it away. My blood mercury was still elevated, not above whatever the normal reference range was, which I thought was crazy anyways, that we had a normal reference range for mercury. But it was in the upper half of the blood reference range, even 3 months after quitting all fish consumption.
Wow.
Which I thought was really interesting. But if you were to look at an HTMA of my mercury, it doesn't seem like it's a problem there, which I found was really interesting too. So it's kind of just part of the story. The only reason I ever really thought that it might have been a problem was the fact that I was eating so much, and the fact that my blood was so high even months after, which my doctor didn't even care, because as long as it's in the range, they don't really usually tell you that much. If you're going to like a normal GP that's not really investigating your case. So
could be a reason for that, right? So mercury is typically, there's certain ways that you can try to get mercury oxalate out, and magnesium sulfate baths is common way to try to get rid of, or Epsom salts, way to try to break up some of those oxalate crystals. But mercury can take a while to show up, right? And really the main way that your body's going to ultimately get that mercury out is through sulfur. various forms of sulfur, whether it's, a thiol compound like, alpha lipoic acid that's trying to drive it out, but mostly, through things like methionine and cysteine. What's the other sulfur containing amino acid? Oh, geez, Ryan, taurine, right? Taurine.
Yeah, taurine, I believe.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. So, I mean, really you're going to get rid of it mostly through those types of compounds, which is another reason why a vegan or vegetarian diet is difficult, right? Because you're
not
losing methionine, right? Especially methionine.
Yeah.
You can generally get cysteine from plants, but not in super high compounds. So it's really, really difficult to get rid of those things, because ultimately various forms of sulfur is what is going to get rid of, your mercury. So mercury, a lot of times on a hair test, can take years before it will begin to come out. So for me, it took, I think it took 6 months of me eating protein for my first several hair tests. I actually could not tolerate sulfur. Probably because I had some very, very significant imbalances, including oxalates. So sulfur and oxalate sulfates and oxalate don't mix real well. Not all sulfur compounds are sulfates, but anyway, it took a little bit. It took about 6 months, got high, and then it went away as I continued to actually eat protein and was able to tolerate it. And it hasn't shown up high for, I don't know, about a year now.
Awesome.
So yeah, I mean, it's, generally speaking, I mean, there was maybe like a 2 or 3 month period I couldn't get a haircut, right, because of COVID and early 2020. But I mean, that's roughly, I mean, that would be probably at least 18 hair tests that I've done, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, I think they do have their place, especially when you're looking at certain mineral balances like potassium, sodium. One thing that I've mentioned to you is that the very first blood indicator I ever had of anything being slightly wrong was my blood sodium was low. And when your blood sodium gets low, because your kidneys and stuff regulate this, it's kind of hard to get there with low sodium and potassium in the blood, because your body, and same with calcium, your body will just keep it for acid balance up there. And so I must have really killed my adrenals to really have actual low sodium in the blood, and to have it that low, which I just that was the first thing where I was like, oh man, something's wrong. But when we're looking at this, as we're kind of coming to the tail end of the podcast, we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, in a future episode, because there's just so many weeds you can get into. I think this was a good just kind of introduction to get people, a little wet, definitely more in depth than I went with Sally Norton as far as different biomarkers. But is kind of like, what can you do if you suspect a problem, and what do you do if you discover that you may have an oxalate problem? And this is kind of nuanced, because it's going to be different for everybody. Like we said, we've kind of looked at each other's HTMAs and blood work, and while we may have similar issues with B6 and or oxalate or both, it's kind of a different game plan when you look at it, because of various mineral imbalances, et cetera, that are just not the same. So there's not a one size fits all.
Yeah. The first thing to solve any problem is to try to figure out if you have one, right? So, what I would say, I mean, if you really want to find out, I'm not sure that I'd recommend this. This is how I figured out that I had an oxalate problem. Stop eating them. Mm-hmm. Stop eating them, and you'll figure it out in a day or two, because your body's going to feel, all of those oxalates are going to start coming out, and you're going to notice something very quickly. For about 2 weeks, I had, B6 toxicity symptoms that would, that very much match what we've both been through. By the way, that also could be the low adrenals, but, we often urinate frequently, right, with B6 toxicity. That also could be a reason for the lower sodium as well. Just that generally leads to electrolytes as we urinate more frequently. But yeah, that, I mean, you could do that. That's probably a good thing you can do on your own. The next, if you suspect it, is, try, I think especially the younger generation, given that I'm in the health insurance business, right, this is actually proven through data, is they don't obtain primary doctors. And I think that if you suspect something, going and getting yourself tested, making sure that if you have insurance to pay for these things, it really helps. But obtaining a primary doctor and then testing, consistently for some of the things that we talked about is maybe the most important thing that I did in my recovery. I can tell you without, that I would have been in really, really big trouble, because otherwise we do desperate things. And even people like me have made really, really bad, drastic health decisions. So I would say if you want to find out on your own, stop eating them. You'll probably find out, pretty quick. Give it a week, and if you feel much worse, you probably have a problem. If you can't do that on your own, please obtain a primary doctor. They're really, really important for your health. It's important to get, find out what your levels are. As we have found out, it's not like we go to our doctors and we find these things. All of the numbers that we're talking about are not out in the open. These are things that we have tested for, right? That we have found like on our own. And without a doctor to go test, and you're just taking a bunch of supplements, you're just asking to start a fire within your body.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think that is a really good point. Seek out a primary care physician, test these things that we talked about: copper, zinc, alkaline phosphate, which is on just a normal CMP. You'll be able to see your sodium, stuff like that. If you want to get an HTMA and you kind of understand the biomechanics of how that works, and you can kind of read it or discern it, that may be valuable for other mineral statuses. Check your B vitamins, because if you're taking various B supplements, you could be offsetting one with another one because you're in excess of something else. It's a nuanced, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in a further episode. I'd like to get into things like vasodilation, blood vessel constriction, what that can do with the way you feel with these sort of problems, because it has a pretty large impact, as we've seen in various groups. If you're wanting to get into a group to know any of this information, there is, I think, what is the name of the group? It's a B6 toxicity Western.
Yeah. Understanding B6 toxicity through Western research, I believe is the official name. Yes.
And I'll put the link to that in the description below. Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on here, and I look forward a ton to the next discussion.